Even before their attacks on Pearl Harbor and in Southeast Asia bring them into open war with the US, Britain, and the Netherlands, Japan had already lost a fortune and 185,000 Japanese lives in their war against China. Yet starting in December 1941, they risked declaring war on two of the world's biggest military powers to try and conquer an enormous swath of land in Southeast Asia. A huge gamble, but the Japanese think it's worth it. Which begs the question, is it? I'm Indy Neidell. This is a World War II in real-time special about the colonial riches of Southeast Asia. So, why do they think it's worth it, you ask? Well, it's the economy, stupid. Okay, a big part of it is the economy. Japan has a big industrial system by Asian standards, but lacks the natural resources to sustain its own production, importing most from abroad. When in the 1930s, the world's powers isolate or form blocks, Japan, with its expansionist, militarist ideology, is increasingly denied unrestricted access to global markets, even as its population expands rapidly. Many in Japan's government and military expect to eventually wage war with their most likely adversary, which for them is the United States of America. But they don't have a large enough domestic production of oil, rubber, or even food, and many other resources to expect to win a long-term conflict. Japanese Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe says in 1938 that the have-not nations, like Japan, need equal access to East Asian markets and resources that haves like Britain and America do. Otherwise, Japan would be forced to destroy the status quo just like Germany. Both claim the need to wage war to gain the resources needed to sustain their empires. And there are a lot of resources that Japan does not have. It only has an export surplus in silk and sulfur. It has a reasonable capacity to sustain itself in graphite, coal, and copper. Still, Japan has to import a large share of metals like iron, lead, zinc, tungsten, and also timber. As for other important resources, hemp, cotton, bauxite, rubber, nickel, tin, petroleum, Japan is pretty much fully dependent on imports from external sources. But many of those resources can be found to the south, in the resource-rich western colonies of Burma, Malaya, French Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies. While Japan produces 400,000 tons of oil domestically a year, that's just about 0.1% of the global production, the Indies and Burma produce 9.7 million tons, or 3.4% of the global production, 34 times Japanese production. Okay, North America produces over 60% of the global supply, with 173.7 million tons of oil in the late 1930s. Luckily for Japan, though, the Southeast Asian oil production would be enough to provide Japan with all its oil needs. Well, if it could be refined and shipped to Japan, of course. It's not just oil, though. Southeast Asia is also home to a large supply of iron, tin, copper, bauxite, nickel, lead, and rubber, as well as agrarian products like, well, natural oils and rice. The latter is very important, as Japan does not have enough domestic food production to feed its own population. Japan plans to obtain these resources by forcing their owners into the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. I've talked about this before. This sphere is designed to make Japan into a have state, not a have-not, and to give Japan access to its fair share of the world's resources. It is framed as a selfless, pan-Asian, anti-imperialist liberation from Western occupants. And of course, the Japanese hope and quite arrogantly assume that they will be embraced as liberators, after which the Asian people will join their fight against the Western powers under Japan's never-setting sun. That might not sound so bad, but in practice, this co-prosperity sphere is just the name for a new Japanese imperialist occupation. There are multiple reasons for this. The Japanese view their superior race as destined to rule over their ethnic relatives. Furthermore, they seek to expand their global power by establishing military dominance in East Asia. But most significant to this episode, the co-prosperity sphere creates a self-sufficient internal economic market. See, Japan will be able to extract all the resources it wants. It will also create a market where Japan can sell its manufactured goods, boosting its domestic economy. Trade restrictions and any limits caused by Japan's foreign purchasing power and the value of the yen won't affect Japan's potential any longer. And that sounds like a great deal, right? But there is a catch. In this internal market, there's only a limited demand for certain resources. Japan, practically the only somewhat industrialized nation in this market, only needs certain resources. And much of the external market is not available anymore because of the war. Take rubber, for example. 85% of the world's natural rubber is produced in Southeast Asia. But Japan does not have a big automotive industry and only needs about 6% of that. The same applies to tin, of which 65% of the global supply is produced in the area. But only around 4% of the world's demand comes from Japan. The rest is sold to places like the US, or it was before the war, and it isn't any longer. But Japan lacks the means to pay for these commodities. So who's going to buy them? And if the answer is no one, then what happens to the producers who suddenly have nowhere to sell it? To finance a war, you usually issue war bonds or increase taxes, but that could undermine stability in these territories and expose the promise of liberation rather than exploitation as a sham. Instead, the Japanese government and its occupation regimes have to print a lot of money, leading to inflation. Also, Japan's industrial potential really isn't that big. It still, for a large part, has an agrarian economy and is not a sleeping giant like the US, which can convert to a huge wartime economy virtually overnight. The availability of lots more resources isn't going to change that. And here's another thing. This internal market, that is the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, doesn't ever really get off the ground. The Japanese are not exporting many manufactured goods. Exports fell from 306 million yen in 1941 to 234 in 1942. That's in today's yen, and will only decline as the war continues. In fact, deficits in manufactured goods like clothing, soap, paper, and medicine start to become a problem in occupied territories shortly after the Japanese arrive. The disappointing export of materials like rubber and tin to Japan and the lack of an export market beyond the co-prosperity sphere also ruins the occupied economies, causing unemployment and destroying their GDPs. Even the extraction of resources, the core reason for the invasion of the area, will not go according to plan. One of the only commodities that sees a significant increase in production is bauxite in Indonesia, doubling between 1940 and 1943. But in general, Japanese import of resources actually declines. In 1941, before the occupation, Japan imports 693 million yen worth of Southeast Asian goods. In 1942, that plummets to 433. In 1943, it rises slightly to 460 million, but that's still far below pre-occupation. Even oil, the motor behind Japan's war machine, does not make it to Japan in anticipated amounts. The country expects to consume roughly 35 million barrels in 1942, 3, and 4. However, only 10.5 million barrels make it in 1942, 14.5 million in 1943, and 5 in 1944. Japan is still burning through its domestic stockpile. While production in the East Indies remains high, most is consumed in Southeast Asia or lost at sea. The geographic location of Japan partly explains this. It's fully dependent on marine transport. Distance to the source of the resources and vulnerability to blockade will prove to be disastrous as the war progresses. As a U.S. bomber survey put it, no country could have been further from self-sufficiency with respect to raw materials than was Japan. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere will turn out to be a bust, economically speaking. And at what cost? Well, the Japanese occupation will destroy the Southeast Asian economies. The Philippines, Indochina, and Indonesia's GDP are halved by the end of the war. It will take years for them to recover. Countless Japanese soldiers are tied up occupying this empty cornucopia, restricting them from fighting elsewhere. Hundreds of thousands of them will die. 4.4 million East Asians will lose their lives in forced labor projects or from one of the many famines caused by a lack of food, clothes, and medical supplies. The ideal of the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere was not much more than make-believe, not only by design, because it was always Japan's plan to take rather than to give, but it would prove to be equally destructive for Japan itself. Do you want to know more about why Japan was denied access to the global markets? Well, you can watch our Between Two Wars video about the rise of Japanese militarism in the early 1930s right here, any second now. And you can join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com to keep our economy running. And like this video and subscribe it and ring the bell. No, I'm not going to do that. I hate that bell. But ring the little one there. It's a good one. See you next time.